Do you know what the scariest thing is? It's when you realize that the weapon that killed hundreds of millions of people throughout history was invented by people who were trying to live forever. They didn't want to kill anyone, they just wanted to escape death. But here's the ironic truth: it was their own fear of death that created humanity's greatest machine of destruction. They never found eternal life, but they did find something that could take anyone's life away. And this story begins in the 9th century, in some remote mountain region of China, probably Sichuan or Shaanxi province, and it had absolutely nothing to do with warfare. These Taoist monks were searching for immortality. They believed they could brew an elixir of eternal life. They mixed minerals together, they heated them up, they experimented with whatever substances they could find. They followed recipes passed down through many generations, but every effort failed. Every experiment was a disaster. They set their laboratories on fire. They burned off their own beards and hair. They never found eternal life, but they accidentally discovered something else. Something far more significant. That accidental explosion created gunpowder, and it became the most important chemical discovery in history. It was the seed for every gun, every cannon, and eventually, every handheld firearm on Earth. But how did this failed medicine become a deadly weapon? Let me take you on a journey to find the answer. From bamboo tubes strapped to spears, to modern firearms. This is the story of accident and innovation. Let's start with what that early gunpowder mixture actually was. It's actually very simple. Understanding the basic chemistry explains everything that followed. That mixture had 3 main ingredients. They were potassium nitrate, also known as saltpeter. Along with charcoal and sulfur, the ratio was about 7:5:1:5:10 by weight. The saltpeter acted as an oxidizer. It released oxygen extremely quickly when heated. This created an incredibly fast combustion reaction. That reaction produced a sudden expansion of gas. And that expansion is the secret behind every application, from fireworks lighting up the night sky to bullets punching through armor. In its earliest applications, gunpowder wasn't a weapon. It was used for fireworks, for smoke signals, and for festival entertainment. Exactly what the monks expected. They were seeking immortality, not weapons. But everything changed when military commanders of the Song dynasty saw it. They recognized the true potential of this explosive powder, and the first weapon was born. Its name was the fire lance. The design was extremely simple. Take a bamboo tube, tie it firmly to the end of a spear, pack gunpowder inside, add some stones or metal fragments. Light it and a burst of flame shot out, firing straight at any enemy within reach, turning a spear into something far more terrifying. Defenders used it during the siege of Dun in 1132. They fought against enemies climbing their walls. According to records, this weapon worked very effectively. It burned and disoriented the attackers. Ordinary spears simply couldn't do that. The psychological impact was also massive. Soldiers who trained their whole lives with swords and spears suddenly faced enemies who could spit fire. That shock often mattered more than actual physical damage. Once gunpowder proved its value in combat, the pace of innovation skyrocketed. Fire lance makers began improving their design. They packed more stones and pottery shards into the tubes, transforming a weapon that only produced flame into one that fired fragments, causing physical damage. This was a major leap forward. It shifted the purpose from intimidation to actual injury, damage from a distance. That was the foundational concept. For every firearm that followed, the next big limitation was the bamboo tube. It couldn't handle high pressure. It would crack or burst. So craftsmen began casting bronze tubes, strong enough to contain the pressure safely. The hand cannon was born, a weapon that used expanding gas from gunpowder to fire a single solid projectile. More powerful than any bow or crossbow by the 13th century. Metal-barreled guns were common in China. This was a huge leap in reliability and effectiveness compared to the earlier bamboo weapons. Chinese engineers also scaled up the concept. They built new weapons with names like the Thunder Crash Bomb and the Heaven-Shaking Cannon, weapons that could destroy city walls, walls that once seemed impenetrable. When the Mongols invaded China in the 13th century, They witnessed these weapons firsthand during the siege of Kaifeng in 1232, and they did what great empires always do: they absorbed that technology. When they conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, they carried gunpowder weapons westward to their new conquests across Asia and toward the Islamic world. This was the most important technology transfer, but it's rarely appreciated enough. The Mongol campaigns acted like an accidental conveyor belt, faster than any trade route or diplomatic mission could manage. They spread China's invention across Eurasia. In just a few generations, here's something important to note. Gunpowder weapons didn't develop in a straight line. Alongside hand cannons and fire lancers, engineers also developed rockets and fire arrows, projectiles propelled by gunpowder. They weren't just used in China, but also in Korea and India, following separate but overlapping paths. Unlike hand cannons, rockets persisted as a distinct branch, one that would reappear in European warfare and later as ancestors of modern space rockets. The story of gunpowder doesn't just lead to the gun. It branches. One branch leads to the firearm. Another completely different branch leads to the rocket, both rooted in the same accidental discovery made by alchemists who had nothing to do with war. From there, the technology spread to Europe through military contact and trade, and through the wave of cultural exchange in the 13th and 14th centuries. Historians point out a fascinating fact: paper printing and the magnetic compass all traveled westward around the same time. A vast flow of technology and knowledge from east to west, long before anyone coined the term globalization. Some historians noticed that early European cannons had structures remarkably similar to Chinese designs. So similar, it's hard to believe it was coincidence. It was inspiration and imitation. When the technology reached Europe in the late 13th century, it landed in a very different political landscape. Gunpowder weapons would completely transform it. They began to dismantle the feudal order that had stood for centuries. The change didn't happen overnight. Early European hand cannons were crude, slow to reload. Still just metal tubes on a wooden pole. You loaded powder and projectile into one end, touched a smoldering ember to the touch hole, and hoped, with more optimism than confidence, that the explosion would send the projectile in the right direction. But even in this primitive form, the weapon had a massive impact. Nothing could match it. Solid castle walls began falling to cannon fire, heavily armored knights, once the elite and most feared force, became vulnerable to a weapon that didn't care about steel. The force from gunpowder was powerful enough to punch through the entire social and military order, built around expensive heavy cavalry, began to crumble. A cheap weapon in the hands of a less expensively trained soldier could now neutralize an opponent who once had the absolute advantage. The impact went far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped the architecture of warfare as cannons grew more powerful and more effective against vertical stone walls. Medieval castles became dangerously obsolete. Military engineers responded. They developed star forts, lower-angled and thickly reinforced fortifications that could deflect cannonballs. The iconic medieval castle was gradually replaced by structures that looked nothing like it, all because of a weapon born from pure accident. The next major leap came in the late 15th century. It was the matchlock mechanism. And this single invention truly changed everything. It transformed gunpowder weapons from clumsy novelties into genuine combat tools. The problem with handheld guns was that they required two hands, one to steady the weapon, the other to touch the ember to the touch hole. Exactly when you wanted to fire, the matchlock mechanism solved this. It attached a burning cord to a curved clamp. This clamp, called a serpentine, was fixed directly to the weapon. When you pulled the trigger, the clamp lowered, bringing the burning cord into the flashpan, automatically igniting the main charge and freeing the shooter to actually aim. This might sound like a small change, but it was truly revolutionary. This was the first mechanical firing device. For the first time in history, a trained soldier could fire a gun with real accuracy, instead of pointing in the general direction and hoping for the best. By the early 15th century, matchlock arquebuses appeared. In the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, they spread rapidly across all of Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire already had experience with gunpowder. They integrated matchlocks into the elite Janissary corps. That was the backbone of Ottoman military power. They used them effectively in battles. Around the same time in the Far East, in 1543, Portuguese traders introduced matchlocks to Japan. Local gunsmiths refined the design meticulously. Japanese matchlocks, known as Tanegashima, were considered some of the finest crafted firearms in the world. Even European observers praised their precision and craftsmanship. Even China, the originator, eventually reabsorbed an improved version of its own invention. They developed a matchlock weapon called the birding gun to counter Mongol incursions along their northern frontier. A strange and fitting historical loop for a technology that began as a failed elixir in that same general region. Matchlock muskets eventually became heavy and powerful, so heavy they needed a forked rest to support the barrel when aiming. Some configurations weighed as much as 25 pounds, but they could punch through plate armor at long range, making swords and pikes increasingly obsolete on the battlefield because reloading and firing took considerable time. Musketeers needed protection from melee attacks, provided by pikemen standing alongside them. This combination of pike and shot dominated European battlefields. From the 16th century into the 17th century, and even beyond, it required extensive training to coordinate effectively. Musketeers fired from behind or between rows of pikemen in tightly organized formations. Outside Europe, many armies adopted the musket, but they lacked that disciplined coordination. They lacked the resources or specific tactical incentives that drove European armies towards this particular evolution. The matchlock had one persistent weakness. Everyone knew about it didn't work well in wet weather. The glow of the burning cord revealed a soldier's position in the dark, and it required constant management of the burning cord, even when nothing was happening on the battlefield. The solution came gradually through several intermediate steps. The wheellock was developed in the early 16th century. It used a spring-loaded wheel spinning rapidly, rubbing against pyrite to generate sparks, eliminating the need for a burning cord entirely. This made wheellocks far more practical for cavalry. They could carry a loaded and ready weapon without needing to tend an open flame while on horseback. German mercenaries and English cavalry particularly favored it throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries. But this mechanism was complex and expensive, which prevented it from fully replacing the cheaper matchlock. Regular infantry still used the older, more affordable design. Well into the following century, then came the flintlock. Generally credited to French gunsmith Marin Le Bourgeois, he developed the recognizable modern mechanism. Around 1610 to 1615, the flintlock used a spring-loaded hammer holding a piece of flint. It struck a steel surface called a frizzen, creating sparks directly into the flash pan, igniting the main charge. It was faster to operate than a matchlock, significantly more reliable in bad weather, and required no open flame to maintain, so it was much safer. By the 1630s, the flintlock had spread across Europe. The Dutch States Army was among the first to officially adopt it. It became the standard infantry weapon, and within just a few decades, it dominated every major European military, a position it would hold for about 2 centuries through the era of colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution, where flintlock muskets carried by militias and British regulars shaped the entire conflict. But there was one more crucial innovation. The socket bayonet was introduced in the late 17th century. It attached around the outside of the barrel with a metal ring, instead of plugging directly into the muzzle. Like earlier designs, you could fix the bayonet and still fire the gun normally, combining ranged firepower and close combat capability. In a single weapon for the first time, the practical impact was enormous. Armies no longer needed dedicated pikemen to protect musketeers, because every soldier carrying a flintlock was now also a pikeman. This combined development is sometimes called the Infantry Revolution. It changed how armies organized themselves on the battlefield, making regiments far more versatile, capable of engaging enemies at range or in close combat without needing to reorganize. Between the two modes of fighting, the bayonet charge also carried its own psychological weight. Rows of men advancing with gleaming bayonets could often break the enemy's morale before a single shot or thrust was ever exchanged. The flintlocks' roughly 2-century reign finally ended in the early 19th century. With the arrival of the percussion cap system, a small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive chemical compound, it ignited instantly when the hammer struck it. This final ignition innovation made every previous mechanism obsolete. Matchlock, wheellock, and flintlock all became outdated. All of them faded into the past within a few decades, marking the last major milestone in this centuries-long journey from crude gunpowder to modern firearms. From there, the pace of change only accelerated, leading toward repeating rifles, rapid advances in metallurgy and manufacturing, and finally weapons that soldiers who once stood in lines with pikes and muskets could never have recognized. Looking back across this entire journey is really a story of accident, accumulation, and migration, all happening over an enormous span of time. Nobody sat down on day one to invent the firearm. A group of monks searching for immortality stumbled upon something that exploded violently enough to burn their beards off. Military engineers watched that explosive reaction, gradually realized its violence could be harnessed, first through a bamboo tube on a spear, then through a cast bronze barrel, finally through complex mechanisms. Each step was aimed at making that basic chemical reaction work more reliably, more quickly, and more safely. Each individual improvement, from bamboo to bronze, from open flame to spring-loaded mechanisms, from matchlock to flintlock, addressed a specific practical problem that soldiers and engineers had encountered. Using the version that came before it, there was no single moment of genius, but centuries of incremental refinement carried across continents, by trade routes and military campaigns, and by slow cultural exchange that quietly reshapes the world. While no one's watching closely enough to see it in real time, it passed between Chinese engineers, Mongol conquerors, Ottoman janissaries, Japanese gunsmiths, and European craftsmen, each group adding their own improvements along the way. And here's the most mind-blowing part: the gun that would end the dominance of armored knights, reshape castles, change the course of history forever. It all started as a mistake made by people who were never trying to build a weapon. They were searching for something much more peaceful, a way to live forever, and instead, they discovered something that could take life with unprecedented efficiency. That is the paradox of human history. Sometimes, our greatest discoveries come from our most misguided efforts. You've seen that clearly now through the story of gunpowder, a journey from eternal life to mass destruction. And I want you to remember this: every technology we have has a story, and it's never as simple as we think. Please subscribe to the 5-Minute Mentor to explore more incredible stories with me, and I'll see you in the next video.